Racist police officers humiliate a black boy, but they did not know that his father was the new police chief. In the outskirts of a large city, there lived a boy named Raphael. He was an ordinary teenager with dark skin, curly hair, and eyes that reflected the hope and innocence of someone who had not yet faced the harshest challenges of life. An only child, Raphael was raised by his mother, Anna, a dedicated and tireless nurse. His father, however, was an absent figure, someone he knew only through the stories Anna told, as he had been transferred to work outside the city many years ago. Raphael had always been a curious and observant young man, but life in the outskirts was not easy. He knew that his skin color made him a target of suspicious looks and hasty judgments, but Anna taught him to always walk with his head held high, to trust in his worth, regardless of what others thought. One day on his way back from school, Raphael decided to take a shortcut through a wealthier neighborhood. He knew he wasn't welcome there, but the path was shorter, and he was running late for an important appointment. As he walked, lost in his thoughts, a police car pulled up beside him. 3 officers stepped out, looking at him with distrust. They began asking harsh questions, what he was doing there, where he lived, if he had a problem. Raphael, not understanding the reason for the questioning, responded politely, but the officers were not interested in his answers. The situation quickly escalated. One of the officers, irritated by Raphael's calm demeanor, shoved him against the wall and began searching him aggressively. "You think you can walk around here without being noticed, boy?" one of the officers sneered, his voice laced with contempt and hostility. Raphael, frightened and humiliated, tried to explain that he was just passing through to save time, but his words fell on deaf ears. The officers laughed among themselves, treating Raphael as if he were a criminal simply for existing in that place. The minutes felt like hours, and Raphael felt increasingly vulnerable and powerless. When the officers finally released him, the young man was shaken but tried not to show his pain. "Get out of here before we decide to take you in," one of the officers said with a malicious grin. Raphael said nothing. He just ran, feeling the weight of injustice on his shoulders. When he got home, Raphael found his mother waiting for him, anxious. She immediately noticed that something was wrong, but Raphael hesitated to tell her what had happened. He didn't want to worry her, and in a way he felt ashamed of what he had gone through. However, Anna knew her son too well to not press the issue, and with a bit of encouragement he eventually revealed everything. Anna was outraged. Her first reaction was one of anger. She wanted to do something right away, but she knew she needed to act cautiously. Raphael, on the other hand, was more concerned about the consequences of reporting the incident. He knew that, more often than not, these stories ended badly for those who dared to challenge authority. Meanwhile, across town, Carlos, Raphael's father, was in an important meeting. He had just been promoted to the position of police chief of the city and was determined to make a difference, especially in areas where police violence and racial discrimination were most prevalent. Carlos had always been a man of integrity with a strong sense of justice, but his work had kept him away from his family, something he deeply regretted. In recent years, he had dedicated himself to rooting out corruption within the police department and promoting a culture of respect and equality. That night, Carlos received a rare call from Anna. Her voice was filled with emotion, and Carlos immediately knew something serious had happened. When Anna told him what had occurred with Raphael, Carlos was silent for a few moments, absorbing the gravity of the situation. He felt a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, guilt. The thought that his own son had been a victim of the behavior he was fighting to eradicate was an almost unbearable blow. Carlos promised Anna that he would handle the matter personally. He knew he couldn't just let it go, but at the same time, he had to act carefully to ensure that justice was served without causing more suffering for his family. The next day, Carlos initiated an internal investigation, disguised as a routine review of police patrols in residential areas. He needed to identify the officers involved in the incident without raising suspicion. In time, Carlos was able to discover the names of the 3 officers. They were men who had been mentioned in other reports of abuse of power, but had never been punished due to a lack of concrete evidence. The situation was delicate. He needed to ensure that the officers' actions were punished, but without exposing his personal connection to the victim. As Carlos carefully devised a plan, Raphael tried to carry on with his life, but the weight of the humiliation he had suffered continued to haunt him. He felt as if his confidence had been shattered, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't forget the looks and words of the officers. Conversations with his mother helped, but they weren't enough to erase the invisible scars he carried. Carlos, on the other hand, was determined to use his position to bring justice, but he knew it would require a strategic approach. He began gathering evidence, discreetly speaking to witnesses and analyzing security camera footage from the area where the incident occurred. The more he investigated, the clearer the extent of the problem became. Those 3 officers were not the only ones involved in abusive practices. There was a systemic pattern of discrimination and violence that needed to be exposed. The tension within the police department increased as Carlos's investigation progressed. Some officers began to realize they were being watched, and the atmosphere of camaraderie was replaced by distrust and fear. Carlos knew he was treading on dangerous ground, but he couldn't turn back. He was determined to cleanse the stain that had tainted the force he led. Meanwhile, Raphael began to notice subtle changes in his daily life. People he barely knew started approaching him with sympathetic looks, as if they knew what had happened, but without saying anything explicitly. School, once a refuge, now felt like a minefield, where he had to be constantly alert to avoid new confrontations. The pressure began to affect his academic performance, and his mother noticed that he was becoming more and more withdrawn. One night, after a particularly difficult day, Raphael decided to confront his father. He needed to understand why Carlos, knowing what had happened, had not done anything visible to defend his own son. Raphael felt a mix of anger and disappointment, and when he finally faced Carlos, the words came out in a rush of emotion. Carlos, for his part, tried to explain his strategy, but Raphael wasn't interested in hearing justifications. "I don't need you to protect me behind the scenes, Dad. I need you to be my father, to stand up for me, to show those guys they can't do this to me or to anyone else," Raphael said, his voice trembling with frustration and sadness. Carlos remained silent for a moment, feeling the weight of his son's words. He knew Raphael was right, but he also knew that any impulsive move could jeopardize everything. After a long moment of reflection, Carlos promised Raphael that he would not rest until justice was served. However, he needed Raphael to trust him, to believe that sometimes justice is slow, but relentless when it finally arrives. Days passed, and Carlos intensified his investigation. He gathered enough evidence to confront the officers involved, but he wanted to do it the right way, ensuring there was no escape for them. Meanwhile, Raphael tried to believe in his father's words, but fear and insecurity continued to loom in his mind. He knew he was dealing with forces much greater than himself, and the sense of helplessness was suffocating. Carlos knew the moment of truth was approaching. He called an extraordinary meeting with the police disciplinary board, presenting the evidence he had gathered. The room fell silent as he began to speak, detailing the abuses committed by the officers and showing that these incidents were not isolated. The expressions on the board members' faces changed as he presented more and more evidence, until there was no doubt about the guilt of those involved. The officers were called to testify, but their defenses were weak and inconsistent. They had not expected to face such a well-substantiated accusation, and the tension in the room was palpable. Carlos maintained a firm posture, but internally, he felt the anguish of exposing a deep wound within the force. He knew the board's decision would be crucial, not just for his son, but for the entire community. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the disciplinary board reached a verdict. The 3 officers were immediately suspended, with the recommendation that they be investigated for abuse of power and racial discrimination. The news spread quickly throughout the police department and the city. The case became an example of what could happen when power was used unjustly and irresponsibly. Carlos, though relieved to see justice being done, knew there was still much work to be done. The culture within the department needed to change, and that would only happen with strong leadership and the trust of the community. He called a press conference to make the case public, knowing it was time to face the problem head-on, without hiding what had happened. At the conference, Carlos spoke firmly about the importance of equal treatment, regardless of skin color or social class. He admitted that the incident involved his own son, but made it clear that this had not influenced his actions as police chief. "If we want to build a just society, we must start in our own house," he said, looking directly into the cameras. "Today we are not just correcting a wrong. We are charting a new path to ensure that all citizens are treated with respect and dignity." Raphael watched the press conference on television, sitting next to his mother. He felt a mix of emotions, pride that his father had finally stood up for him, but also a lingering sadness for what had happened. He knew the fight against prejudice wasn't over, but seeing his father take a public stand helped him regain some of his lost confidence. The days that followed were full of activity. The local community, once distrustful and resentful of the police, began to show signs of hope. Carlos continued his work, implementing new training policies for officers, focusing on human rights and conflict mediation. He knew these changes were just the beginning of a long and arduous process. Meanwhile, Raphael began to be seen differently by the community. He was no longer just the boy who had suffered abuse. He became a symbol of resistance and resilience. His schoolmates, who once looked at him indifferently, now respected him for his courage in facing such a difficult situation. But Raphael knew that true change didn't come from others' respect or admiration, but from the inner strength he had to find to overcome the trauma. One day, while walking down the street where the incident had happened, Raphael saw one of the officers who had humiliated him. The man was leaving a convenience store, and their eyes met for a brief moment. The officer, who once wore an expression of superiority, now looked ashamed and uncomfortable. Raphael felt a pang of anger but also a strange sense of compassion. He knew the man was paying the price for his actions, but he also understood that hatred would get him nowhere. Raphael decided to keep walking without exchanging words with the officer. There was something liberating in that gesture, an affirmation that he would not be defined by what had happened, but by what he chose to be from that moment on. When he arrived home, he found his mother in the kitchen, preparing dinner. She looked at him and, without saying a word, understood that something had changed in her son. Raphael smiled, and in that smile, Anna saw the strength and maturity he had gained. Months passed, and the changes implemented by Carlos began to show results. The police department, once stained by cases of abuse and discrimination, was now seen as an example of reform and renewal. Of course, there was still much work to be done, but Carlos was determined to continue, knowing that every step in the right direction was a victory. Raphael, in turn, began to get more involved in the community. He joined a group of young activists who fought for equality and social justice. Using his own experience as an example, Raphael inspired others not to give up, to fight for their rights, even when the road seemed difficult. He realized that instead of being a victim, he could be an agent of change, someone who would use his voice to make a difference. At one of the group's meetings, Raphael was invited to speak. He stepped onto the stage, looking at the hopeful faces in the crowd. "A few months ago, I was just a scared kid who thought the world was against me," he began with a steady voice. "But today I know I'm not alone. We are the change we want to see. And together we can build a world where no one has to go through what I went through." Raphael's words were met with applause and shouts of support. He felt a wave of emotion wash over him, but this time, it was a positive emotion, full of hope and purpose. He looked at his mother, who was in the front row, her eyes shining with pride. And in that moment, Raphael knew that despite everything, he had found his strength. As time went on, Raphael and Carlos continued to work for a more just world, each in their own area, but always with the same goal: to ensure that future generations would not have to face the prejudice and injustice they had faced. And so, what began as a story of pain and humiliation turned into a powerful narrative of resilience, courage, and, above all, transformation. The city was never the same after that episode. The actions of Carlos and the strength of Raphael inspired other leaders and citizens to unite to build a more inclusive and equal society. The legacy of that moment extended far beyond Raphael's family, affecting lives and hearts throughout the city and beyond. Change was slow, but it was happening, and every step forward was a victory that could not be forgotten. And so, with time, Raphael grew up and became a strong man, respected by everyone not just for his story but for his character and determination. He knew the world still had much to improve, but he was ready to face any challenge that came his way. After all, he had learned the hard way that true strength doesn't come from muscles or harsh words, but from the courage to keep going even when the road seems impossible. Raphael and Carlos's journey was, at its core, the journey of everyone who seeks justice in an imperfect world. And as long as there are people like them willing to fight for what is right, there will always be hope for a better future.